They called it a joke, but it wasn't. She tilted her head, let her bracelets chime, and said, "No gift from Grandma, too poor." And the room did that thing rooms do when cruelty arrives wearing perfume. It brightened for everyone else and dimmed for me. I am 81. I live above a small public library that smells of dust and lemon oil after closing. And if I lean out my back window, I can see a slice of parking lot where teenagers practice driving in the late afternoon, and a single maple that insists on turning early each year, as if it can't stand one more hour of holding its color. I make tea in a chipped pot, keep my shoes by the door like a soldier's kit, and have learned a silence that is not surrender, but a private country where my breath has citizenship. Yet the night of the engagement party returns like a draft under a door, and I cannot help following it down the hall of memory to the moment her laugh turned my palms cold around the envelope I had ironed with my hand on the kitchen table to make it smooth. I had dressed in the navy crepe I keep for occasions that require a respectful sort of invisibility, the kind where you match the chair backs and the good cutlery, and you are allowed to be present so long as you do not remind anyone of the math that built their comfort. And I pinned my hair the way my husband used to like it, before the chemo took away the part of me that cared if a man preferred one silhouette over another. And I traveled by bus, because parking in their neighborhood has rules that multiply like rabbits, and I refused to feel stupid in front of a sign. And I carried that envelope in my handbag with the same care you give a sleeping child, because inside it lay the deed to the small yellow house on Brookview, the house my grandson and his fiancée had been renting for a year, the house he first learned to whistle in when he was 6, and I was still quick enough to chase him through the hall with a dish towel like a flag, the house whose cabinets remember the weight of my wedding china and whose back step holds a stain shaped like Oregon from the evening he knocked over the paint for his school volcano. The house was mine to give because it had been mine to keep through storms and layoffs and the kind of Januaries that fold old people in half. And I had decided to hand it to them the way a person hands another a second chance at feeling rooted, not as a performance, but as an inheritance measured in floorboards and windows that stick in July. I had rehearsed the private words, "It's yours," with my blessing. Treat the roses kindly. The yellow ones get black spot. If you neglect them, sign here at your leisure. Let the ink dry before you stack the pages. Keep the folder flat. Tell no one what you paid, because you paid in birthday cakes and stitches that disappeared when he outgrew his knee. And I had told myself not to cry, because tears, at my age, are too easily misread as weakness when they are simply salt leaving a country that refuses to be landlocked. The party was a case study in modern abundance, the kind of lights that make skin look like it believes in itself, a pyramid of canapes that resembled architecture, voices braided with polite ambition, the smudge of a rented photo booth where youth can archive its own astonishment. There were people who greeted me the way you greet a sponsor at a charity event, warmly, carefully, with an eye toward introductions that might be useful later. And there were people who did not know where to place me in the seating chart of meaning, and so let me stand near the buffet with my plate balanced on my palm. And there was my boy. No, he is a man, but to me, he is always the child who hid toy dinosaurs in my slippers, moving through his guests with the efficient joy of someone who believes the future will arrive on time because he has already measured the room for it. She found me just as I was deciding whether the pale pink thing on toast was fish or an idea about fish, and she smiled in that crisp way women learn when they have been told it's prettier to be amused than to be kind. And she tapped the edge of my envelope with a fingernail painted the color of unforgiving fruit and said the line that will outlive many birthdays. I said nothing at first, because there are words that bloom behind the ribs before they ever reach the mouth, and mine were still choosing a shape that would not embarrass either of us, and I looked past her to the foyer where my grandson was laughing with his friends, and I thought, he will glance over, he will catch my eye, he will come, he will say, "This is my grandmother. She taught me how to knead dough and how to wait for the kettle to sing before you pour. She keeps her promises the way brick keeps heat, and we will open this together, and there will be a small hush around the paper, like the hush before a candle is blown out. And maybe then I will allow myself one tear that can be mistaken for joy if anyone requires a simpler story." But the glance did not come, and the hush belonged to someone else's toast. And so I said only, "Open it," because I have learned that explanations are often the most expensive part of generosity, and her laugh turned brighter for the crowd nearest us, and in that brightness I saw what was coming, not the practical outcome. I am no prophet of paperwork, but the emotional shape of it, the way a seam rips where the fabric has been thinned by too many small pulls, and I steadied my hand against the corner of the table where someone had placed a vase of tulips that refused to droop, and I watched the envelope change hands the way a baton changes a race, and I remembered how he used to hoard the birthday envelopes under the bed because the crisp sound of new bills made him giddy, and I remembered his first apartment with the mattress on the floor and the thrift store lamp and the pride that made him unbearable and endearing in the same breath. And I remembered the way he wept into my cardigan when his father's heart failed while my soup cooled untouched on the stove, and how, after the funeral, he stayed behind to help me count the casserole dishes like they were a currency against loneliness. And then the memory settled like dust after a rug is shaken, and I was simply a woman in a dress that had seen better lighting, standing beneath a ceiling that had paid for itself many times with the presence of money. She slit the flap with a knife borrowed from the cheese board, and it made a sound that startled me, a sound like the first tear in fabric that had always sworn it would hold, and I felt, not shame, but the prickle that precedes a decision you do not yet know you are making, and the room's temperature rose by degrees that only the old can notice, and somewhere a photographer asked people to scoot closer so the algorithm would recognize them later. And I thought about the maple outside my window at home and how it blushes early because it knows what it knows. And I thought about my husband's hands when they were still sure. And I thought about the deed, its sober paper, its ink that has seen more kitchens than courtrooms. And I thought about what it means to give away the thing that kept you upright through the winters when the pipes sounded like regret. I will tell you this now, before you decide who I am. I did not come for applause. I did not come for absolution. I did not come to buy a chair at the family table that should have been set for me without receipt. I came because I believed that love, which has done its arithmetic, deserves to rest. And I believe that a house which has absorbed your history will behave like a good memory in someone else's hands, if invited properly. And I believe that laughter at the threshold of kindness is only a nervous noise that will quiet once the meaning is revealed. Perhaps you will say, I am naive. Perhaps you will say, I should have stuck a bow on it and performed the gesture in the dialect the young speak fluently. Perhaps you will ask why a woman who knows about winters would trust a room full of air conditioning with her heart. But I am telling this as it was, not as an advice column would prefer it. And the simple truth is that when she laughed and the nearest heads turned, I felt myself becoming something I did not recognize, a woman measured by absence, no shiny package, no curated photo, no visible place in the social architecture of the evening. And I did not like that measurement, not because it made me small, for I have been small with dignity before, but because it made me irrelevant in a story I had built from the ground up. I know who I am. I am the woman who taught her grandson that patience is a kind of wealth, that doors open easier when you've got a cake in your hands, that a promise is an object you can misplace if you fail to dust it. I am the woman who paid the property taxes when the roof sulked in February, and the bank looked at me like a miscalculation of their own, who patched a marriage with thrift and a boy with kindness, who knows the exact angle to turn the stubborn key in the back lock when it swells in damp weather, and who now stood at a table of expensive cheeses feeling the clear beginning of a story that would end somewhere colder if I did not warm it with the thing I still owned, my choice. She held the deed without recognition because paper does not shout, and the crowd drifted away the way tides do once the moon decides there is nothing to see. And I thought, I will not explain it here. I will not unwrap the scaffolding of this gift in front of people who applaud appetizers. I will let the quiet do what it does best, which is travel, and I will go home to my small apartment above the library where the children's room hums with unbroken laughter at 4 o'clock, and I will sit by the window and press my palm flat on the envelope-shaped absence in my bag and ask the world a question it has answered for me before, which is, when you are mistaken for less, what do you give to yourself to restore the measure? And how long do you wait before you learn the grammar of keeping what would otherwise be wasted on the unready? The moment the flap of the envelope sighed open and no one's face changed, I understood that a gift can die quietly in the hands of those who do not know its language, and I stood there, holding a paper plate with something peach-colored, melting on toast, while my grandson's fiancée peeled the deed from its sleeve like a receipt that needed checking, and then slid it back without looking at the words that might have steadied us. And she smiled with that bright, courteous glaze that keeps a room comfortable, and she said she would show him later because they had a thing to cut and a list to announce and a ring to photograph against the rim of a champagne glass. And I nodded as if I, too, loved schedules more than thresholds, then excused myself to the hallway where the good coats waited like well-behaved animals, and I pretended to search my bag for reading glasses I did not need. And from that small distance, I watched my boy lean into a friend's shoulder and laugh, and I waited for the tiniest tilt of his head toward me, the old signal that said, "Come closer, you are the reason this is possible." But the moment did not arrive, and when I finally gathered my shawl and my dignity and made the long walk to the bus stop through a neighborhood that looks expensive even when no one is looking at it, I told myself that gratitude sometimes travels slower than ridicule, that perhaps he would call once the last chair was stacked and the playlist had stopped flattering everyone. In the morning there was no call, only a text from an unknown number that turned out to be the wedding planner asking for my mailing address so they could send links to registries in case you wanted guidance. And I stared at the tiny screen and thought about the guidance I had already placed in their hands with the weight of a roof and a key and the instructions any old house whispers to its next caretakers, then set the phone face down and made tea strong enough to stand a spoon. And by afternoon, my grandson sent an email instead of a voice, a clean paragraph in a tone he uses for clients, thanking me for the gesture and noting that Jess's family had a broader strategy for property and that any transfer should be aligned with their timeline, and that I must understand how these things work now that interest rates do a complicated dance. And I sat very still while that single word worked its splinter under the nail of my calm gesture, as if I had quietly placed a centerpiece on their table rather than a life's backbone. I wrote back with care, no storm, only a sentence about the envelope not being a suggestion and an invitation to tea so we could sign where signing was needed. And I pressed send and listened to the little whoosh and pretended it was a human breath. But the reply came from her account, cheerful and managerial, proposing that if I insisted on moving forward, we could convert the gift to cash at closing and free the couple to look at a newer build with better light and less maintenance, because the yellow house was charming but small, and they were thinking children sooner than expected. And would I be comfortable routing all communication through her going forward, as it would be easier for everyone? The room tilted, the way rooms tilt when a person hears the law of her extinction pronounced with a smile. And I stood, because standing is what keeps blood honest. And I tried to imagine this new house with its clean, agreeable drywall and its surgical light and the absence of the stain on the back step shaped like Oregon. And I tried to imagine my grandson telling a child that once upon a time a stubborn window sang in July, and that the trick was to lift, then push, then lift again, and I could not. And that was when the phone rang with a number I knew by its accent, the property manager for their lease, a brisk, considerate woman who had always spoken to me as if we shared a secret, and she apologized for the timing and inquired whether I had in fact already executed a quitclaim, because she had received an online inquiry from a broker representing Jess's family about valuation and early termination, and she wanted to make sure nothing illegal took root in the cracks where courtesy fails. I thanked her, and my thank you carried all the weight of a winter door slamming shut on the draft of being managed out of my own history. And after we hung up, I took from the drawer the worn manila folder that holds the paper map of my stubbornness, and I laid it on the kitchen table like a patient. And I read lines I could recite by heart, and each clause returned me to a day when my hands were not yet arthritic, from opening every jar in a household that required me, and from folding every sheet in a household that forgot me. And I thought of my husband, who read contracts as if they were weather, and I thought of the afternoon he came home, cheeks windburned, and said the roof would hold for one more season if we treated it like something alive. And I thought of how giving is not a dessert you pass around, hoping someone leaves you a slice of thanks, but a verb that tries to make a place where two lives can meet in their right sizes. And with that knowledge warming me more than the tea now gone cool, I walked to the yellow house, because sometimes you must visit the scene of your intention to measure the distance between meaning and outcome. The sidewalk remembered me. An old woman can tell when stone gives way by a fraction, and the porch boards lifted their familiar complaint as I stepped onto them, and through the front window I saw the list they had taped beside the door, a grid of chores written in tidy letters that did not sweat, and I saw that the roses had been cut wrong so the canes would sulk in spring, and I stood with my hand on the paint that needs tending, and I realized the insult was not that they had laughed or planned to upgrade me into exchangeable currency, but that they had treated the deed like a trinket, not understanding that it was not a transaction, but the handing over of a story with instructions for listening. A car slowed, and someone inside waved, because in that part of town we are still waved at in daylight, and I waved back. And then I turned toward the bus stop with the folder pressed against my ribs beneath my coat, as if one organ had a name and the others did not. And when I reached home, there was a voicemail from a polite man who introduced himself as a broker and said he had been asked to evaluate options, and would I be open to discussing the best way to optimize this asset for the young couple's future. And he used a phrase about unlocking trapped value. And I stood very still again, because the only trapped value I could see was the boy who used to climb the cherry tree and rip his pants and sob until I let him stir the custard, and I deleted the message and wrote his number on paper, because paper cannot ambush you with cheerful pings at dinner. That evening my grandson finally called, and his voice was sweet and careful and a little tired, and he said he hoped I wasn't upset, and that Jess can be blunt but means well, and that building a life is complicated, and that the house has been a blessing but needs work, and that they felt blindsided by the surprise at the party because they would have preferred to coordinate with her parents so everyone contributed the same way. And in that speech, I heard a man trying to keep peace between two weather systems without checking the barometer, and I said I was not upset, I was educated. And he laughed a small nervous laugh and asked what I meant, and I told him that when you give someone a chair at your table and they stand on it to reach a higher shelf, you learn something blessed and irreversible about where you belong. And there was a long breath on the line, and then he said he loved me, and I said I loved him, and the love did not fix the day, but it documented its existence. And when we hung up, I washed my cup and closed the drawer and laid the folder back in its place and felt the first true click of the lock that would mark the beginning of the long movement from offering to boundary. That click was the catalyst, not fire, not a door slamming, but the clean, small sound of a woman deciding that the past had been generous enough and that the next step would be taken with both hands on the rail and the map folded to the page that shows the way out. I woke the next morning with the kind of heaviness that does not belong to sleep, but to thought that refuses to turn itself off. And for a long while, I stayed still under the quilt, watching the rectangle of light creep across the wall and thinking how strange it is that betrayal rarely arrives as thunder, how it comes instead as paperwork, politeness, and the slow erasure of a name from the vocabulary of belonging. I made coffee strong enough to hold me upright, sat at the small table by the window, and reread my grandson's message as if repetition might change its temperature. The more I read it, the colder the words became, the more I felt that he had not written to his grandmother, but to a donor who had failed to read the fine print of an invisible contract. I wanted to be angry, but anger requires an opponent, and all I had was a polite distance. So I began tidying things that were already tidy, folded dish towels, watered plants that didn't need it, dusted the framed photograph of him as a child, holding the wooden airplane we made one summer when the heat bent the air and he said he wanted to fly away, and I realized that he had, only not the way we imagined. I decided to walk because motion is a kind of translation for pain. The sidewalks were damp from a night rain. The air smelled faintly of tin and pine, and I moved slowly toward the market, counting the cracks in the pavement, the way people count beads when they can't pray anymore. Every few blocks, I passed a house that looked like a sibling of the yellow one. Same bones, but different lives painted onto them, and I wondered about the people inside, whether they still sit on the steps at dusk, whether they argue about curtains, whether they know the names of the birds that come each spring. When I reached the square, I bought a loaf of bread still warm from the oven and carried it under my arm like a secret, and at a small bench by the fountain, I sat down and watched pigeons patrol the crumbs of other people's lives. That was when I decided that if gratitude could not reach me, I would at least keep my own dignity from starving. I took from my bag the old folder, the one that carried the deed, and opened it once more, not to mourn it, but to remind myself that I was still capable of choosing. I thought of the lawyer's card the property manager had once given me, a woman who wore sensible shoes and listened more than she spoke. The next morning, I called her office and asked for an appointment. She did not sound surprised. Perhaps she has a tone reserved for women of my age who arrive with documents that smell faintly of disappointment. Her name was Fiona. She had a tidy office that looked like it believed in second chances. I sat across from her and placed the folder on her desk with the same care you place an animal that might still bite. She skimmed the papers, asked a few questions, and then looked up with the calm certainty of someone who knows the map even when others think they are lost. "You haven't filed the transfer yet," she said, "which means it isn't legal until you do. If you wish to retain ownership, we simply record a rescission and notify the county." The words sounded both sharp and merciful. I asked if it would cause trouble for the tenants, meaning my grandson and his fiancée, and she said, "Only if they plan to treat your gift as leverage." I smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was accurate. We completed the papers quietly. My hands shook a little when signing, but I steadied them by remembering the years of work that had paid each installment, the nights my husband and I patched leaks with humor and glue, the mornings we measured our patience instead of our wealth. When I left Fiona's office, I felt neither triumphant nor vengeful. I felt like a house that had finally found its own foundation again. The next week passed in a peculiar calm, the kind that follows a storm that everyone else pretends didn't happen. There were no calls from my grandson, no messages from the fiancé, only a postcard from a friend in Oregon showing a lake surrounded by fir trees. I pinned it to the fridge and told myself that silence is a kind of weather and not always hostile. Yet something inside me had shifted. I began walking earlier each morning, longer routes, through neighborhoods that did not know my name. I liked the anonymity of traffic, the way engines disguise thoughts. One day, I wandered into an antique shop filled with the smell of dust and lemon oil. On a shelf near the window was a small ceramic bird, cracked at the tail but still bright, and I bought it without thinking, placed it on my kitchen windowsill where the light could find it each morning. It became a sort of companion, a proof that beauty need not be new to be alive, but the calm could not hold forever. In the second week, I received an envelope with my grandson's handwriting. My heart did what old hearts do. It mistook hope for relief. Inside were printed pages, a draft of a restructuring agreement prepared by someone from Jess's family firm, stating that upon finalization of certain investments, the property at Brookview would be liquidated, and that I, as co-owner, would be fairly compensated. The language was polite, detached, entirely bloodless. There was a sticky note on the first page in Jess's neat script. "Just to formalize things. Thanks again for helping us get started. XO." I sat down slowly, letter trembling between my fingers, and laughed once, not cruelly, but in disbelief at how efficiently affection can be translated into legalese. I took a pen, drew a single line through the entire packet, and wrote across the top in red ink, "No further discussion necessary." The next day, I mailed it back to them without a return address. That evening, I made soup from the vegetables I had bought at the market, ate it at the table where my husband and I once planned our vacations, and felt the quiet expand in the room like a companion who does not need conversation to stay. Days folded into each other. Occasionally, I caught myself rehearsing speeches I would never deliver, explanations about respect, about heritage, about the arithmetic of sacrifice. But the air in the apartment grew lighter, as though I had exhaled something that had been waiting too long. I started volunteering at the library downstairs, shelving returns in the afternoons, enjoying the hush of pages and the smell of effort. The librarian, a woman half my age, told me I had a graceful way with order, and I smiled because grace was a word I hadn't worn in years. One evening after closing, I stayed to dust the children's section and found a forgotten mitten on the reading rug. I placed it on the counter for someone to claim, and for a moment the gesture felt holy, a small restoration of what the world misplaces without meaning to. Then came the letter from the broker again, polite as ever, reminding me that there were open questions regarding the property's valuation. I ignored it. The following week he called, voice smoother than his letters. He said Jess had expressed concern that I might be confused, that perhaps my lawyer had misinformed me, that she wanted to ensure I was not taken advantage of. His tone was syrup poured over vinegar. I thanked him for his care and told him the only person taking advantage of me was himself by wasting my minutes, and then I hung up before he could reply. That night, I slept better than I had in months. By early March, the roses outside the yellow house should have been showing their first green shoots. I took the bus one afternoon to check, out of habit more than hope. From the corner, I saw that the garden beds had been stripped bare. Someone had planted ornamental grasses instead, tidy and passionless. The front porch had a new swing, white and soulless, the kind you buy from a catalog. I didn't walk closer. I just stood there long enough to confirm that the house no longer knew me, and I whispered a small apology to the walls for having handed them to people who saw shelter but not story. Then I turned away, walked back toward the bus stop, and in the reflection of a shop window caught sight of myself, smaller than I remembered but not broken, an outline sharpening rather than fading. Back home, I brewed tea and opened my notebook, the one I had used to track bills and recipes. I turned to a clean page and wrote 3 words, begin again elsewhere. Beneath them, I listed possibilities, travel, a hobby, maybe even moving nearer to the coast. The list wasn't a plan yet, just evidence of willingness. And while the kettle hissed, I realized that the quiet worsening of things had already reached its limit. The house was gone to me. The boy I raised had become a stranger wrapped in courtesy, and yet my life had space in it again. I looked out the window at the parking lot below, where the same teenagers were learning to drive, their laughter reckless and beautiful, and I smiled because they did not know yet how many small deaths adulthood requires, or how many resurrections it secretly allows. I decided that the next resurrection would belong to me. When the thaw finally came, it was almost shy, the kind that begins with sound rather than color, water running under the crust of ice, gutters clearing their throats, the quiet pulse of a season pretending it hasn't broken anything. I had not been back to the yellow house since that last walk, but its outline followed me like a watermark. Every time I saw a porch light or a set of freshly painted steps, I felt the muscle of memory tighten, and yet something else had begun to grow beside the ache. A calm, not triumphant, but deliberate, the way soil settles after being turned. I was sitting in the library one afternoon, reshelving returns, when the librarian mentioned that the community center was looking for volunteers to read to children on Saturdays. The idea startled me. I had not read aloud to anyone in years, not since my grandson was small enough to fall asleep on the curve of my arm. I told her I would think about it, but by the time I locked up that night, I already knew I would go. The following weekend, I walked there with the old canvas bag that still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the years I carried baked goods to church fairs. The center was housed in what used to be a fire station. The walls were red brick, and the floor echoed like it remembered alarms. The children were restless and bright, faces that refuse stillness, questions that arrive faster than breath. I chose an old book with a cover half torn, a story about a crow that wanted to collect stars, and as I read, their noise quieted into listening. The smallest girl, her hair in 2 thick braids, asked if crows ever really talked. "Only to people who know how to listen," I said, and she nodded with the gravity of someone who believed me. Afterward, they hugged me in that unmeasured way children do when they haven't learned to ration affection, and I realized I had been starving for that simple proof that what I offered could still reach someone. The walks home from the center became longer each week. I would stop by the bakery for a loaf and chat with the woman behind the counter whose laughter had no edge. She began saving the end pieces for me because she said I looked like someone who could make soup out of anything. She was right. I filled my days with small acts of usefulness, tending the shared garden behind the library, mending the torn flags for the veterans group, rewriting old recipes so they wouldn't be lost when I wasn't around, to remind anyone that a pinch is not a measurement, but an instinct. I was busy without being hurried, and that felt new. Somewhere in the midst of these quiet adjustments, I realized I had stopped checking my phone for messages. Weeks had passed without a word from him or from her. At first, the silence had been a wound. Now it was a balm. I began to understand that peace is sometimes just the exhaustion of caring about things that refuse to be gentle. Then, one morning, as I was watering the geraniums on my windowsill, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old address. The envelope was heavy cream stock with embossed initials I didn't recognize. Inside was an invitation to the wedding, formal language, printed gold script, my name misspelled by a single letter that made me someone else. I sat down and read it twice, then turned it over as if the truth might be hiding on the back. The wedding was to be held at a vineyard 2 hours away, a place so new the trees must have still been learning their roots. I traced the date with my finger and felt nothing like anger. I felt only distance, the kind that cannot be traveled by car. I placed the invitation on the table and covered it with a small stone I kept from the garden path of the yellow house, a paperweight for things that no longer required my attendance. That evening, I baked a pie for the library staff instead. As the crust browned, I imagined the vineyard, the dresses, the photographs that would later be arranged into albums I would never see, and I whispered a quiet blessing that they might know how to care for what they build, even if they never learned where the foundation came from. Days later, the librarian asked me if I could cover a weekday morning shift at the front desk. I agreed and found myself meeting people I had never seen before, retirees hunting for travel guides, students half awake, mothers corralling toddlers. One of them, a man about my age, came in every Tuesday for the newspaper. He always nodded, always polite, and one day he lingered long enough to ask if I had ever been to the botanical gardens because he had a spare ticket. His name was Leonard. He wore a jacket too thin for the season and had a way of looking at flowers like they were explaining something important. I said yes, because no was the word I had used too often. The gardens were nearly empty, just the two of us walking along gravel paths where the air smelled of wet earth and early lilies. He told me about losing his wife 5 years earlier, about how grief had made him collect seeds, as if he could plant her back into being, and I told him about a house with a yellow porch and the sound paper makes when laughter turns it to ash. We didn't trade pity, we traded comprehension. When we parted, he pressed a packet of zinnia seeds into my hand and said, "They'll grow even if you forget to watch." I went home and planted them in an old ceramic pot, not for beauty, but for proof that something could still take root. By early summer, my apartment had changed in ways small but precise. The ceramic bird watched over the zinnias, the shelves filled with borrowed books, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and promise. I caught my reflection one afternoon and realized I looked not younger, but less erased. The change startled me, not because I had tried for it, but because it had happened in the absence of anyone's permission. I understood then that the midpoint of any story worth telling is not when the world alters its attitude toward you, but when you cease rehearsing your lines in someone else's play. I had stopped auditioning for the role of the good grandmother, the patient donor, the pleasant relic. I was simply a woman with a key, a kettle, and mornings that belonged to her. Still, there was one thing left undone: the yellow house. I could not rest until I had made peace with its ghost. I took the bus one Sunday when the city was still yawning and walked the last blocks alone. The new owners were out front, a young couple with a dog that barked once and then decided I was harmless. They had painted the porch pale green, and in the window hung curtains that moved like quiet lungs. The woman smiled and asked if I was lost. "No," I said, "just visiting an old address." She tilted her head, and for a moment I saw curiosity unclouded by suspicion. "It's a good house," she said, and I nodded. "Yes, it is." I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I walked away slowly, feeling the gravel shift under my shoes, and when I reached the corner, I turned once more. The house looked content, maybe even loved. That was enough. When I returned home, the zinnias had begun to sprout, thin green threads pushing through the soil like sentences, just learning their first words. I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the light move across the room. For the first time in a long while, I felt the shape of a future that didn't depend on forgiveness. It was quiet, almost modest, but it was mine. I opened my notebook again and crossed out the phrase, "Begin again elsewhere." Beneath it, I wrote a single word: here. I had thought the story had reached its calm, that the yellow house and the people inside it had drifted far enough from me to become harmless shadows. But autumn has a way of shaking loose whatever we have convinced ourselves is settled. It began with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and for reasons I still don't understand, I answered. It was my grandson. His voice was softer than I remembered, careful, like someone walking across thin ice. He said he hoped I was well, that married life was good, that they had moved back into the yellow house because the new owners had sold quickly after a job transfer, and for a while the words came so easily that I almost believed we were both pretending for kindness. Then his tone shifted, the way weather changes before you notice the clouds, and he asked if I still had the old maintenance records for the property because there had been an issue with the foundation, and the new paperwork was unclear about who had authorized the repairs before the sale. I told him I would look. What I did not say was that I knew every receipt by heart, that I had sealed them in an envelope the day I reclaimed the deed, and that nothing about that house was unclear to me. When I hung up, I sat in the silence that followed, and I could feel the old ache stirring, not fresh, but persistent, the ache of being needed only for the pieces of the past that could still be useful. I went to the drawer where the folder rested, and for a long time I traced the edge of it, thinking of how much effort we spend keeping records of things that no longer belong to us, and how strange it is that love itself leaves no paperwork sturdy enough to withstand interpretation. The next day, I met Leonard for coffee at a small shop near the gardens. We had fallen into a rhythm by then, two widowed souls orbiting each other carefully, not lovers, not quite friends, but something steadier, something like weather that you can count on. He told me about the school garden where he volunteered, how the children had planted marigolds in crooked rows and named each plant as if it were a pet. When I mentioned the call from my grandson, he listened without comment, only reached across the table to touch the back of my hand and said, "It's hard when the past pretends to be paperwork." The phrase stayed with me. On the way home, I stopped at the post office to mail a few library forms, and standing in line, I saw a young couple at the counter, the woman pregnant, the man juggling a stack of boxes labeled fragile. She laughed at something he said, the sound easy, unguarded, and I felt the small sting of envy, not because of youth or promise, but because of how effortlessly they seemed to occupy the same story. I wondered if my grandson and his wife laughed like that when no one was watching. I wanted to believe so, though belief and hope have become expensive habits for me. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one was not cream stock, but brown, utilitarian, the kind that smells faintly of dust and seriousness. Inside was a notice from the county clerk's office about a pending inquiry concerning the title history of the Brookview property. Someone, most likely them, had filed a request for clarification. The words were dry, legal, but beneath them I could hear the tremor of accusation, the suggestion that I had acted irregularly, maybe even dishonestly, in reasserting ownership. I read it 3 times, then placed it on the table beside the zinnias, now blooming fiercely, as if defying the season. For the first time in months, I felt the pulse of anger that I had mistaken for age quieted down into clarity. I called Fiona, my lawyer, and read the letter aloud. She listened, then said in her calm voice, "It's routine, don't take it personally, but I'll handle it." I laughed at that because everything about this was personal. She asked if I wanted to contest publicly or let her respond on paper. I told her to respond in ink, not in anger. When we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, thinking about how some storms arrive long after the clouds have drifted away. The following Sunday, I went again to the community center, but my reading voice trembled. The children noticed. One small boy asked if I was sick. "Just tired," I said, though what I meant was tired of being rewritten. After the session, I walked home through the park. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leaves, and I felt the urge to write a letter, not to my grandson, but to the girl he had once been, before life and laughter hardened him into politeness. I took out paper that evening and began without planning. "My dear boy, I do not want anything from you. Not apology, not money, not the echo of love performed out of duty. I only want you to understand that when I handed you that envelope, I was not offering property, but memory. I was saying, here, this is the map of where you began. Take care of it." And when it was refused, something in me folded quietly closed, not out of spite, but survival. The letter grew until the page was full. I signed it with just my name, no titles. I never sent it. It wasn't meant for mail. It was meant for peace. By November, the inquiry had been resolved. Fiona called to tell me everything was clear, that I had nothing to fear. But clarity does not prevent disappointment. It only lights it up more starkly. A week later, my grandson appeared at my door. I had not seen him in nearly a year. He looked older, wearier, the easy brightness in his face replaced by a kind of polite fatigue. I invited him in. He stood awkwardly by the window, looking at the plants, the ceramic bird, the stack of books on the table. He said they were sorry for any confusion, that the title issue had been a mistake, that Jess hadn't meant for it to go so far. I told him it was all right, But as he spoke, I realized he had not come to apologize, only to perform reconciliation so he could tell himself he had tried. When he asked if I would consider selling the house back to them now that things had settled, something inside me laughed, silently, incredulously. I asked him why, and he said they wanted to raise their family there, that it would mean a lot, that they could pay market value. The word market value tasted metallic. I asked if Jess had sent him. He hesitated, then nodded. I looked at the window where my zinnias had begun to brown, and I said, "No, dear, some places are not for sale again. They're already paid for." He started to speak, but I stopped him gently, offered him tea instead. We sat in the small kitchen, the clock ticking between us. I told him stories he had forgotten, the paint stain on the step, the cherry tree that had once bent under the weight of too many blossoms. And for a few minutes I saw him listening, truly listening. Then his phone buzzed, and he looked down, murmured something about having to go. When he left, he kissed my cheek the way people do when they're in a hurry to feel moral. I watched him cross the street, and for the first time, I did not feel abandoned. I felt released. But life, as I have learned, never grants closure without testing it. December came early that year, brittle and loud. The first snow had barely dusted the sidewalks when a letter arrived from Jess. It was brief, written in a tone I couldn't quite name, somewhere between accusation and confession. She said she had found my letter, the unsent one, among some old documents her husband had misplaced, and that it had broken her heart to read it. She said she understood now that I must have felt unappreciated, and that she wanted to make amends by inviting me to Christmas dinner as family, no expectations. I folded the letter slowly, reading each line twice. How had she found it? I remembered burning the envelope weeks after writing it, or at least I thought I had. Perhaps memory is kinder than fact. I decided not to answer immediately. For days, I turned the question over. Was forgiveness a gift to her or to myself? Leonard said forgiveness is not about erasing what happened, but choosing where you stand when you remember it. On Christmas Eve, I called the number on the letter. Her voice was bright, rehearsed. She sounded nervous. I told her I appreciated the invitation, but that I already had plans. She asked, "With who?" And I said, "With myself." There was a silence long enough to reveal understanding. Then she said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "So am I." That night I made a small dinner for one, lit a candle, and sat by the window, watching the snow collect in quiet drifts. I thought about the yellow house, about its new tenants perhaps setting a tree in the corner, children laughing, lights trembling against the glass. I did not feel jealousy. I felt something quieter, an understanding that sometimes love must travel a full circle through disappointment before it can return to its simplest form, wishing someone well without needing to be seen doing it. When midnight came, I took from the cupboard the last of the rose tea my husband had bought years ago, steeped it until the color deepened, and toasted the empty room. In January, I received a postcard. No return address, just an image of the yellow house dusted in snow. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew, were 4 words. "It's a good home." That was all. I held it between my fingers until the paper grew warm, and I laughed softly because it didn't matter who had sent it, perhaps Jess, perhaps a stranger, but the sentence was true. The house was good. It was safe. And for the first time in years, I no longer needed to own it to believe it. I placed the postcard on the windowsill beside the ceramic bird and watched the evening light slide across both. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that something enormous and invisible had completed its orbit. I closed the curtains and let the night come, not as a threat, but as a witness. I had not planned to see the house again, not in daylight, not ever, but life has a way of pulling you toward what you believe you have released, as if testing the truth of your calm. It was early spring when the letter from the city arrived, official, stamped in blue, notifying me that the property on Brookview was scheduled for a neighborhood inspection following reports of water damage that might affect adjoining lots. Because my name was still listed on one historical record, I was invited, though not required, to attend. I could have ignored it, thrown it away as easily as one tears off a calendar page, but I didn't. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not for nostalgia, but for armor. The gray coat with deep pockets, the one my husband used to say, made me look like someone who could not be convinced against her will. I took the bus through streets that had already forgotten my footsteps. The air smelled of thaw and possibility, the cruelest combination. When I stepped off at Brookview, the house stood at the end of the street as it always had, changed yet recognizable, the way a face ages but keeps its outline. The porch was a softer green now, the curtains white. There was a swing with a cushion embroidered with initials I didn't know. I thought of all the seasons it had endured without me, and I felt both smaller and freer. The inspector was already there, clipboard in hand, making notes, while a man I assumed to be the current owner pointed out a gutter that had detached from the eaves. I introduced myself quietly, said I had once owned the property. He smiled, shook my hand, and thanked me for the care I had given it, as if he could see the history in the grain of the wood. I walked around the house slowly, the way one reads an old letter whose ending you already know, but still crave to reach. The garden beds were tidy, the roses beginning their cautious return. Someone had built a small sandbox near the fence, and a child's red shovel lay half buried. It struck me then with absolute clarity that the house had achieved what I had wanted for it all along, to shelter laughter that wasn't brittle, to hold stories that didn't bruise. I realized that my real quarrel had never been with my grandson or his wife, but with my own belief that love proves itself through ownership. The truth was simpler and harsher. You can care for something your whole life, but care is not the same as claim. The inspector finished his notes, thanked me for my time, and drove away. The owner went inside. I stayed. There was no reason to, yet my feet refused to move. I sat on the bottom step of the porch, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, and let memory unwind itself. I thought of the first day we saw the house, my husband and I, young and ambitious in a modest way, how we had stood in the empty living room and promised to fill it with laughter, with books, with a boy who would know the value of steady things. I thought of that boy, my grandson, now a man I barely recognized, and for the first time I forgave him without effort. He had inherited my stubbornness, but not my patience. He had learned from a world that mistakes pride for progress. I had expected him to understand gifts the way I did, as acts of continuity. But how could he, when his whole generation was taught that to accept is to owe? Forgiveness arrived not as a choice, but as an exhale. I looked at the sky and whispered his name, not as accusation, but as prayer. When I finally stood, a car was pulling up to the curb. It was them. Jess stepped out first, dressed simply, no armor of brightness. He followed slower, holding a small box. They hadn't seen me yet. I could have left, spared us all the awkwardness, but some instinct, maternal or foolish, kept me there. She noticed me first and froze, then nudged him. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, none of us spoke. Then he smiled, not the practiced smile of a man keeping peace, but the unguarded one of a child who remembers safety. "Grandma," he said, the word falling between us like something newly minted. I nodded. They approached. Jess held out the box. "We wanted to find you," she said, "before you heard it from someone else. We bought the house." I blinked, certain I had misheard. She explained that the previous owners were moving abroad, that they had saved for 2 years, that it wasn't charity, it wasn't a gesture. It was theirs now, properly, with their names on the deed. "We thought you might want to see it one last time," she added. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. He opened the box. Inside was a small frame containing a photograph of the house, taken from the same angle as an old picture I had kept for decades, the one of my husband on the porch painting the railing. Beneath the photo, on the mat, they had written in careful script, "For everything that started here." Something in me gave way. I took the frame, held it with both hands. My eyes burned, but my voice stayed steady. "It's a good house," I said, repeating the words from the anonymous postcard, and they both nodded as if they knew exactly what I meant. We stood there for a long time, 3 figures caught in the soft indecision of forgiveness. I saw then that they had not come to reclaim anything but to return something invisible, a bridge, a bit of faith, perhaps just decency. She asked if I wanted to come inside. For a moment I imagined the rooms, repainted, rearranged, alive with new furniture, but also haunted by my own memories of birthdays and winters and mornings heavy with coffee and purpose. "No," I said finally. "I think it's enough to see it from here." He looked disappointed, but I smiled. "Houses remember footsteps," I added, "and mine are already in there." They thanked me for coming, though I hadn't been invited, and I thanked them for buying it, though I had never wanted them to. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the small silver key I had carried all these years. I placed it in his hand. "It doesn't open anything anymore," I said, "but keep it anyway. A house should always have more than one key." His fingers closed around it like a vow. Jess whispered, "You're welcome any time." I nodded, knowing I would never return. We said our goodbyes with a gentleness that had been missing from our family for too long. As they walked inside, I heard the screen door creak and the faint sound of laughter, unforced, ordinary, alive. I turned away before it could turn into pain. The bus ride home was quiet. Through the window, the city looked softer, as if spring had washed it clean. I felt the odd lightness that comes when you finally stop rehearsing your losses and start inhabiting them as facts. I understood then that the climax of this long story wasn't the confrontation or even the forgiveness. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the past no longer owed me anything. I had done what I could, given what I had, reclaimed what was necessary, and let the rest dissolve. That night, I placed the photograph on my desk beside the zinnias, now blooming again from last year's seeds, stubborn as hope. I wrote a single line in my notebook. What you keep is not what you own, but what you understand. Later, before bed, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, thinking how love, at its ripest, resembles release more than possession. For decades I had been holding my life like a deed, names, addresses, the proof of continuity. And now, for the first time, my hands were empty and my heart was not. The city breathed around me, indifferent and kind. I thought of the young woman I had been when I first bought that house, so certain that security meant permanence. I wanted to tell her that permanence is only another word for waiting too long to change. I wanted to tell her that she would survive every silence, every misunderstanding, and find her own voice again. I turned off the light, lay down, and felt the gentle exhaustion of something completed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like pages being turned. The story, at last, had learned how to end itself. The weeks after that afternoon on Brookview passed with a kind of stillness that was not emptiness, but balance, the quiet that remains after the sea withdraws and you finally see the sand again. I began to wake earlier, not out of habit, but because the mornings felt generous, the air cooler, the light less demanding. The library below my apartment had started its renovation, and every day the sound of hammers and voices drifted upward through the floorboards, like proof that life continues to build itself, regardless of who listens. I found the rhythm comforting. I brewed my coffee slowly, stood by the window, and watched children run to school, their backpacks bouncing like heartbeats, and I wondered which of them would grow into kindness, which into ambition, and how many would learn too late that those two things can be the same if you let them. My own ambitions had shrunk to scale: finish a book, bake bread on Sundays, tend the zinnias now leaning toward the glass as if searching for gossip. Some evenings Leonard visited. We shared quiet dinners, sometimes music, sometimes nothing but the clicking of our forks. He had become a presence so natural I no longer rehearsed what to say, and I think he loved me for that unadorned honesty, the way one loves a landscape that doesn't pretend to be anything but itself. One afternoon we went together to the gardens where we had first met. The trees were full again, everything rinsed clean by a recent rain. He pointed to a bed of lilies and said they reminded him of forgiveness, bright but unshowy, and I thought how gentle it was to compare virtue to something that simply grows toward light without asking if it's earned. As we walked, he told me his daughter was moving overseas and that he would visit her in the fall. He asked if I might come too, just for a few weeks, to see a different sky. I told him I would think about it, though I already knew I would. There was no reason to stay chained to familiar streets when memory had already done its accounting. We sat on a bench near the pond, the same one where we had spoken of grief months before, and for a long while we said nothing. The wind moved through the reeds with that same rhythm as breath after crying. It felt like the world was exhaling with us. Back home, I sorted through drawers, the slow archaeology of a life. I found letters from my husband tied with a ribbon turned the color of tea, recipes written in my mother's slant, a photograph of my grandson at 10, holding a sparker. His face lit with joy so pure, it made me forgive everything all over again. I placed that photo inside the frame they had given me, next to the picture of the house, so that the past and the present could keep each other company. For the first time in years, I felt that every version of myself, the young wife, the widow, the bewildered grandmother, the woman learning to live alone, had been invited to sit at the same table, no quarrels left among them. The anger that had once defined my days now felt foreign, like a language I had forgotten. One morning, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a photograph of a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket, his name printed neatly on the back, my great-grandson. The note beneath said only, "We hope you'll meet him when you're ready. The house is waiting for your visit." I held the photo against my chest, feeling his smallness like warmth. I did not cry. There are tears meant for loss and others meant for arrival, and sometimes the body cannot tell them apart. I placed the picture beside the zinnias and whispered, "Welcome." That night I dreamed of the house again, but differently, not as a place I had lost, but as one where laughter kept circling back like birds returning each spring. I woke smiling, certain that the story had found its rhythm. In the following weeks I began to write, not letters this time, but a record, part memory, part observation, part prayer, disguised as prose. I wrote about how love shifts shape with each decade, about the cruelty of being unseen and the equal cruelty of expecting to be seen exactly as we wish. I wrote that forgiveness isn't a door you open once, but a threshold you keep sweeping so others may cross without stumbling. Sometimes I imagined another woman reading these pages years from now, someone my age, maybe older, sitting in her own kitchen wondering if she had given too much. And I hoped she would find in my words a small proof that giving is never wasted, only transformed. When Leonard's trip came, I walked him to the station. He hugged me tightly, promised letters, promised to bring seeds from foreign soil. As the train pulled away, I felt no sadness, only gratitude for the chance to have met someone who looked at me and saw not years, but light. That evening I returned home, made tea, opened the window, and let the city's hum pour in. The air smelled faintly of rain and new grass. I sat at my desk and looked at the photograph of the baby, at the house behind him in the background, at the sunlight spilling across the porch, and I realized that everything I had tried to hold had found its way back in another form. Ownership, love, forgiveness. They were all the same motion, the hand letting go so something softer can land there. I ended my journal that night with one line. Peace is not forgetting, it is remembering without hunger. Then I closed the book, blew out the candle, and stood for a moment by the window. Below, the library lights glowed like small lanterns, and I thought of the children I had read to, the stories they would carry forward, the way words survive in people long after we stop speaking. The clock ticked, unbothered by endings. I whispered goodnight to the world, not out of loneliness but ceremony, the way a mother tucks in a sleeping child, and then I went to bed with the easy certainty that nothing essential had been lost, only rearranged into the quiet order that waits at the end of all storms.